What's up guys, welcome to another quick lesson on Laravel. One of the things that some people find confusing when loading nested relationship in Laravel is how to avoid loading all the columns in the middle table. Let's say for example you have profiles table, countries table, continents table. In profiles table you have country ID that references ID in the countries table. Similarly, in countries table, you have continent ID that references ID in the continents table. Profiles has no direct relationship with continents, but through nested relationship, we can load continents for each profile. That is profile.country.continent. That way, we can tell the continent for each profile. But by default, when you do something like profile.country.continent, every column in the countries table will be loaded. One of the things we are going to learn is how to avoid loading all the columns in this middle table when we load nested relationships. With that in mind, let's head over to the codes. Over to the codes, what I have is a new Laravel project with a little setup. The setup is such that we can focus on the business of the day, which is to write some queries. In order to do that, I have connected to the database, so you connect to the database. Secondly, I have created some migration files for the tables that we have in our little sketch here. That is profiles table, countries table, continents table. Let me quickly show you that. By default, a new Laravel project comes with this users table, so I did not create this, and there was no changes there. There were no changes. I created the continents table. Continents table only has this name column and the default ID and timestamps columns. Also, there is countries table. Countries table has the name column, that is country name, as well as a foreign key continent ID that references ID in the continents table, and of course the default columns ID and timestamps. And then the profiles table. The profiles table has the column bio, country ID that references ID in the countries table, user ID that references ID in the users table. These correspond to what we have in our sketch here. In line with that, I also created some models for those tables. So we have continent model that defines relationship between continent and countries. Remember that continent and countries, there is a one-to-many relationship through this continent ID. A continent can have multiple countries belonging to it. Also, in the country model, we have the relationship between country and continent. This says that a country belongs to a continent. By the way, if you don't understand these relationships, make sure you watch one of the previous lessons where we dealt with all those relationships in Laravel. One to many, many to many, has one true, has many true, and all that. We have already covered this. Then we have profile model. In the profile model, we have relationship between the profile and the country, as well as relationship between profile and the user. That is it for the model. Also, there is a database seeder. In the database seeder, we insert some data in the tables so that we can easily test the queries that we are going to write. What is going on here is that I have a constructor method. In the constructor, I create a faker object. With faker, we can insert data in our tables. The data we are going to insert is for the 4 tables, that is continents, countries, profile, and users. For countries and continents, I have this helper function, helper method, that returns an array of continents and their countries. So this basically returns array Africa, the countries, Asia, etc., etc. That is this helper method. Up here, I am calling the method to get that array. For each of the continents, I will insert a record in the continents table. Then, for each of the countries that belong to a continent, I will insert records in the countries table. This is where we are seeding the continents and the countries. By the way, the code for this project repo will be included in the description, so you can just grab that if you need to. Down here is where we seed the users and profiles table. For users, I will go ahead to make use of the factory method that comes with a new Laravel project. If I go to factories folder, you can see user factory is already defined. So why not we just make use of it here and insert a number of records in the users table. For each user, we create a profile. That is, we seed the profile table. That is what I have for the database seeder. With that in mind, with all those explanations, let's go ahead and start writing the queries. For the queries, I made a controller called demo controller. Inside the controller, we have 3 methods. These are the methods we are going to use to write simple queries and then something not too simple. Also, if I go to api.php route, we have 3 route definitions for those 3 methods that we have in demo controller. So now let's write some queries. The first thing I'm going to do is something quite simple, which is to fetch all the countries, right? So I'll just say countries to be equal to country, or everyone knows this, I believe. I will do return response JSON countries. This will get all the countries. Before we can test this response, we need to first run the migration. So I will go over to the terminal, php artisan migrate. This will run the migrations. If I go to database, it is empty. Now let me refresh the tables. We have our tables, but our tables are empty. Well, we have the database seeder, so let's go ahead and insert some records there. php artisan db seed. We successfully insert records in the table. Let me go back and check. Continents, we have all the continents. Countries, we have all the countries. Profiles, we have profiles for each of the users. There are 1000, I think there are more than that actually, as well as users, right? So our database seeder works fine as expected. Let's go ahead and open Postman to call the endpoint that returns this response. In that case, let's open the api.php. The endpoint we are going to call is countries. I will head over to Postman. I have 3 requests added here, one for countries, one for the other queries, and the other one for the subsequent queries. Anyway, I will go ahead to call the endpoint to get countries, send. Okay, we don't have the server up and running. I will open a different tab and php artisan serve. That will start the server. I will go back to Postman, send one more time. We get the countries, right? Exactly as it is in the countries table. Take a look here. We have continent ID. But let's assume that in the front end, we don't just want to display country and continent ID. It doesn't make sense to be showing the user continent ID. What we want to do is to show the user the continent name instead of the continent ID. We are going to go back to our query and modify it a little bit to get the continent name. Back to the controller, what I will do is to modify this query. For subsequent queries, we are going to make use of Eloquent, but just permit me to mix things a little bit by using DB facade here. So I will say DB, make sure to import that table. The table of interest is countries. Countries. We come down here. We join the continent table. So join actually let me do this per line. Continents such that continent.id is equal to countries.continent.id. So this is just joining the continents table where continents ID equals countries.continent.id. Down here we select the table, the columns we are interested in. For example, we can say select countries.id. Let me copy this, paste a couple of times. Countries.name, that is country name, and countries. Let's get continent ID. Down here, instead of countries, we say continents.name. Continents.name as continent. Continent name. So we don't have conflict mistaking this country's name and continent name. We load continent name as continent_name. Finally, we can order this in ascending order. So we say order by countries. By default, it is ascending. Yeah, let me hover over this here. So by default is ascending, but just to make it clear, we say ascending. That is A to Z. Finally, we can say let's just take few of them. There's no need loading all those countries. Let's take 100. Oh, come on. I have to add get. What we have changed is this time we are selecting continent name instead of just continent ID like we did earlier. If I save this, I will go back to Postman, call the same endpoint again. Something is wrong somewhere. Okay, this doesn't make sense. Order by has to be by a column, right? So we can say countries.name. That was the error, I believe. If I go back and send again, this time we get country name, continent name. That is a little improvement from what we had earlier. Let's take things a little bit further. Our next goal is to load continents grouped by their countries. Let me show you what I mean. So here we begin to make use of relationship in the reverse direction. I will say continent to be equal to continent, or for now let me just get all, and we modify this in a moment. Return response JSON continent. We call the endpoint. Let me go to api.php. This endpoint that gets continents, go over to Postman, call that endpoint. Hit send. We get just what we have in the continents table. But what we want to have is, given a continent, we also want to get the list of countries that belongs to it. That is some nested array, right? Where the continent is the key, the countries are the values. To do that, I will go back to demo controller and the method we are working with. Here I will just say continent with, say with countries. and we say get. Remember, we defined that relationship. Let me go to continent model. We have this countries relationship. That is why we are able to come over here at demo controller and say continent with countries according to that relationship. If I go back to Postman and send, you can see that this time for each continent, for example, Africa, we get the list of countries that belongs to that continent, right? Similar thing for Asia as well as other continents. Let's take things a little bit further. The next thing we are going to do is, let me go back to our sketch here. For a profile, we are going to load continents, making sure that only specified columns from the middle table is loaded. Let me show you a couple of things with that. The first thing is the basic stuff. I will say profiles to be equal to profile all. This will get all the profiles. So I will say return response JSON profiles. We go ahead and open Postman. Let me show you the endpoint we are going to call this very endpoint. Head over to Postman, call that endpoint. That is taking some time. Okay, that took some time because there is a lot of records. Let me reduce. Let me just get 100 records. There's no point loading all this. I'll say just take like 100 and get. Go back to Postman, send. That is faster now. Okay. For nested relationships, let's take things one step at a time. The first thing I'm going to do is to load the immediate relationship, that is profile and country. In that case, I will modify this query a little bit. I will say get profile with country. Let's take 100 records. Get. Remember that in the profile model, we defined the relationship between profile and country. That is why we are able to say profile with country. However, at this time, this is going to load all the columns in profiles table as well as all the columns in the countries table for the given records. We head over to Postman. Go ahead and make the call from Postman. Here we get the profile and the country, loading all the columns. Recall that a profile belongs to both country and the user. In that case, we can actually load both country and user with profile. How do we do that? We can make use of array. In that case, I'll put array here. Come down, we say load profile with country as well as with user. Let me move this to the next line and this to the next line. So like this, we can load multiple relationships. We go back to Postman, we click send. You can see that for each profile, we get both country and user. Again, we are loading all the columns from the users table. Let's take things a little bit further by loading the specific columns we are interested in. In that case, we can say we put column after the relationship we want to load. We put the primary key and let's take the country name as country underscore name. Similar thing for user, we put column, we put ID. There's no space between the column and ID. Please take note. No spacing here. We take the name as user underscore name. This way we specify the columns we want, right? Go back to Postman, click send. You can see that now we get the name of the country as well as the name of the user. Always make sure you have the primary key ID and the primary key ID as we have it there. Let's go another step further. This time we are going to load that nested relationship. That is this. Remember that profile has no information about continent, but through country we can get continent for each of the profiles. Over to the code. The way we are going to do that is actually straightforward. We say country dot continent. I will go back to Postman, send. You can see that for each of the profiles we get country, but continent is null. Of course, we also get user. The reason continent is null is because we have not selected any column that maps those relationships that we have here. Profile has country ID that references ID in the countries table. Then country has continent ID that references ID in the continent table. For that loading of nested relationship to work, we need to include continent ID in the thing we are selecting. If you look here, there is no place we are selecting the continent ID, right? That is why in our result here, continent is null. We need to specify, we need to select that column that maps the relationship. And that column is found in the countries table. So in the country relationship, I'm going to put a comma here and select continent ID. Continent ID. With this specified, Eloquent will be able to load this nested relationship. That is one thing to take note of. I will go back here, click send once again. This time you can see that we have continent along with country, and of course we have user. But we are not done. Currently we are loading all the columns from this table, from the continent table. What we are going to do is to specify the specific columns we want to load here. Similar to what we did before, it is straightforward. We put colon and we say give us the name, the ID of course, the ID first, and then the name as continent underscore name. This way we select only what we are interested in this case, the continent underscore name. Go back and click send. This time we pick only the continent name instead of all the items in that column. One other thing you would have noticed is that we are loading all the columns in profiles. Now this might be what you need, but just in case you want to pick specific columns from the profile, we are actually going to do that. What we are going to do is we come over to profile, we come over to this query, we say select. This select will refer to the profile, the model that we started with here. What do we want to select? We can just say bio, that is the profile bio. Let's just leave that at that for now. If I go back to Postman and click send, we are going to get some strange result. You can see we just have the bio that comes from the profile, but now the country is null, the user is null. Of course, without the country we cannot even talk about continents. Why did that happen? This brings us to the same problem. When you are loading nested relationship, always load those columns that specifies the relationships. In the profiles, we are selecting only the bio column this time around. The reason this was working before is because we were selecting all the columns from profile like this. But this time we are specifying the columns we want to select, right? That is why things broke. What I am going to do is, for now, let's just select user profile, user ID, because profiles table has user ID. If I go back, we should be able to get user information. So we get user information because we loaded that column that defined the relationship. In a similar way, we can of course say country ID. If I go back now, we get country and of course continent information because we have loaded all those columns that define those relationships. A quick reminder guys, please hit the like and subscribe button if you haven't done so to help the channel grow and so that this content can get to other people that might need it. Before we go further, I want to quickly mention one of the problems that we've solved in this lesson. That is to load nested relationship, making sure that only specific columns from the middle table is loaded. Although we have already solved that, but let me quickly demonstrate something. We solved that at this line of code where we are selecting specific columns from the countries table. But if I comment this out, let's just assume that you are primarily interested in the continents information, right? And I go back to Postman and call that endpoint. You can see that here, although we are interested in the continents information, every column in the countries table is loaded. That was loaded at this point where we said country before we said .continent. So our solution was to load specific columns from the countries table. That way, we have only information that we require from that table. Alright, so looking at what we have done so far, I believe that our objective for this lesson has been covered. We've been able to query the profile and the relationship between profile and the country, as well as nested relationship between profile and continent. Just a quick recap of what we have done. Initially, we wrote some simple query that just returns all the countries. But here, we join the continent so that instead of displaying the continent ID in the front end or whatever client, we can actually display the continent name, which we are selecting here. Down here, we did a simple eager loading where we selected the continent with continent. By the way, this is eager loading. We are loading everything at once, kind of. Finally, we have seen how we can load nested relationship through the middle table. We have profile, we have country, we have continent. Profile knows nothing about continent, but country does. Through country, we can load continent for each of the profiles. And that brings us to the end of this lesson. Once again, guys, please hit the like button and subscribe if you have not done so. Until next time, happy coding.